We often think of the book of Revelation as this cryptic map of the end times, full of beasts, plagues, and predictions about the future. But what if we've been reading it wrong? My guest today is Dr. Shane Wood, a New Testament scholar and author of the recent book, Thinning the Veil: Encountering Jesus Christ in the Book of Revelation. In this interview, he argues that the book of Revelation wasn't written to satisfy our curiosity about what's coming. It was written to transform us now. You'll hear how its symbols, visions, and warnings speak directly to our fear, our suffering, and even our political idolatry. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by Revelation or wondered how it could be spiritually meaningful, this interview will give you a whole new lens for reading it. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian. Let's get started. Dr. Wood, early in the book, you say that Revelation is meant to transform the reader by revealing Jesus Christ, not to predict the future. Why is that the key to understanding the whole book?
Yeah, it's kind of the key to understanding prophecy as a whole. A lot of the times, whether you're talking in Christian culture or non-Christian culture, when we use the word prophecy or prophesy, we usually think predict. The problem is that even the word itself, when you look it up, every time it's used, Old Testament, New Testament, in the Hebrew and the Greek, it's only in the context of a prediction 17% of the time.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so even the very word itself doesn't lend itself to how we typically define it. But the purpose of a prophet, Old or New Testament, was always to call a rebellious people to repentance, or to strengthen a people that were under some sort of suffering or oppression to continue to endure. So prophecy is always expecting a response. It's always expecting, the goal is always the reader. And so in some sense, and so the fact of the matter is, though, is that 17% of the time there is some sort of prediction, but it's like we flip the ratios. We think 83% of the time is talking about a prediction. But if there is a prediction, it is in service of a greater goal, and that's the transformation of the reader, the response of the reader.
Very good. How does John's experience in Revelation 1
Hmm.
show that loneliness can
Mhm.
be more than suffering? So the viewers might be like, why are you talking about loneliness? It's somewhat shocking in the book when you're reading, I think it is chapter 1, because in the
Mhm.
intro you talk about Revelation not really being intended to predict the future, but
Mhm.
transform the reader. But then in chapter 1, you shift to talking about loneliness. So how does John's experience in Revelation 1 show that loneliness can be more than suffering, that it can
Mhm.
actually be a kind of doorway into divine intimacy?
You're not the first person that's told me they were a little shocked that I started with loneliness in chapter 1. Part of that came about, though, from me trying to not just, um, uh, it's to remember, one of the things that's easy for us to forget is that every book of the New Testament is written to real people at a real time going through real issues. But one of the things that, whenever I'm talking to my students, we spend so much time building the context of the original audience that we kind of forget about the original author. And it was part of my reflection on Revelation is I'm going, John is exiled on the island of Patmos, Revelation 1:9. But he is not there. He's not there by choice. It kind of reminded me where part of this sank in as I was reading Ovid for some project I was working on. And at a certain point, he's exiled on an island, and he writes some of his deepest poetry on this island where and it was one in particular, and I'm not going to be able to remember the reference right now, but he's describing his longing to be present at a triumphal procession. And he's describing in detail what he can imagine, but he's not able to be at. And my thought was, oh my goodness, whenever you're in exile, you're taken away from everything that's familiar, everything that you love, all the people that are closest to you. It is a type, it is an oppression, it is a persecution. And so then I started to notice elements of this response, really a trauma response from the loneliness that John was experiencing throughout the book. So John is uncontrollably weeping in chapter 5 and has to be consoled by an elder. He bows down and worships an angel twice in Revelation. You're like, if this is the apostle, or let's just even pretend this is a community remembering the apostle, that's a very striking response for somebody that spent 3 years with Jesus. What's fascinating, though, is that it's in this state of loneliness whenever John chooses to, instead of, I won't use the word lament, but instead of leaning on the victimization of the moment, John leans more heavily on his knees. He goes to prayer. And it even talks about him worshiping on the Lord's Day. And it's in that space whenever our loneliness drives us to a deeper craving of the Lord, that loneliness becomes a strange conduit for intimacy with God. And part of that, where I wrestle in that chapter, is looking at saints of old, from Saint John of the Cross to Mother Teresa herself, and even wrestling with my own struggles with loneliness over the last couple of years for a multitude of reasons in my world. I found that I was able to taste the presence of God more acutely if I allowed that loneliness to not be something that turns on me or keeps me in a state of victimized, but actually pushes me deeper into craving Christ himself.
I think that's excellent insight into the immediate sort of application that the book of Revelation can have for us as we reflect on maybe areas that, if it's not loneliness, maybe some sense of separation or unfortunate set of circumstances. All of these can be this kind of doorway into divine intimacy, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
I may, at this point, back up slightly. I'll probably edit this to where it looks like this part came earlier.
Sure.
I had one additional thought that I wanted to include. Sorry, I have some allergies.
Yeah, you're good.
I had one additional thought that I wanted to include on my first question. So you threw out this number. Only 17% of the time is prophecy in the Bible about predicting the future, and see in the Bible about predicting the future. I'm not sure where that figure came from. It's your own study. So,
it was my own study. Yeah.
Here's what I suspect somebody might say. That number is highly dependent on how you would interpret these prophecies. And so you can't just necessarily throw out 17% and expect to get away with it. Somebody's going to want to be like, well, wait, let's talk about each one of these. And I'm not going to ask you to go through one by one. That would take far beyond this video. But with respect to just the book of Revelation, what do you think is like the main reason? If you could give one, I'm thinking of a particular one that you mentioned in the book, and you can throw in more if you'd like. But if you could give just one reason why the book of Revelation is not about predicting the future, what would that one reason be?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So it's because of so Revelation chapter 1 verse 3, we actually get an example of the word prophecy being used. And how it is used sets really the tone for the entire book. Now, I actually think the most important thing for us to remember is the first 5 words of the book is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Like, it's trying to say, hey, this is what I want to talk about. But in chapter 1, verse 3, it says, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. This would have been a literate community, so they would have been experiencing revelation more with their eyes closed and the words read over them than with a page in a book the way that I have right here. But then it says this, it says, and blessed are those who hear it. And the NIV translates this next word, take to heart, but it actually means heed or obey what is written in it. And my question is how do you obey a prediction? It's this very strange, like, hey, Shane, you're going to die next Thursday. Obey this prediction. And it's like, okay, I'll try to, not cross the street very safely. Like, I don't really know what I'm required. So even in the way that it's using the word prophecy in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, it is assuming a different goal than merely a cosmic fortune teller. It assumes that what is revealed will compel you to action. It will actually, it is giving you something to follow or to obey. And what is that? It's the revelation of Jesus Christ, where ultimately The goal of Revelation is Revelation 14, verse 3, where it's the image of this 144,000 that have ran the good race, and it describes them as, and they followed the Lamb wherever he went. That's the goal. And these 7 churches of Asia Minor needed that type of clarity and that type of compulsion because of, frankly, the suffering and the persecution, whether physical or non-physical, that they were experiencing at the end of the first century.
Yes, that's actually different than the reason I expected you to give. So I'm going to throw that one in a moment.
Yeah.
But just as one additional tension with thinking that this is a highly predictive book, like the bulk of the book is about the future, and not just the future, but for John's readers or this community, whoever wrote the book. Well, I'm just saying John,
Right.
but
Sure.
whoever wrote the book, for those readers, or I should say listeners, because like you said, the first opening verses are like, "Blessed is the one who hears this," and
Yeah, sure.
these things, if it were about the future, it would have been the really distant future, and that makes it the tension even greater with respect to what it would even mean to obey it. Like if you told me today that 2,000 years from now, governments are going to do this, and there's going to be this dictator that does blah blah blah, like. If you told me that, and then you said obey, what am I supposed to do? That's
Right.
2,000 years away. Like, what am I even gonna do?
And no, and you're exactly right. And frankly, the thing is too is like if these Christians really are going through a difficult moment during the intensity, really, of Domitian, the last half of Domitian's reign, the emperor at the time, and John writes to them as a pastor, and then just takes the whole 404 verses to talk about something that won't even affect them 2,000 years from now. Like he's just a bad pastor. John assumes that what he is writing to these churches that he loves and that he misses, he assumes that what he's writing is ministering to them when he can't be there to minister to them in the flesh. And so there's just like an oddity to the very narrative. If all of this is 2,000 years, I'm going, then why the charade of the first 3 chapters? Just jump right into the breaking of the seals, and let's just get on with it.
Okay, one more point about why this isn't a prediction, and then I want to shift to what the book is really about, which is the transformation that it had on the listeners / readers at that point, and how that the way that it was applied to them, how that might look for application to us today. Okay, this last point is I believe you say that there are 6 ends of the world. Like if you track in the book of Revelation, the world ends 6 times. Am I remembering? Is it 6 or more?
I count 7, but yeah.
7. Okay,
Yep.
I misremembered. 7 times. And yeah, you might want to elaborate on that point, but it looks like if you think this is about the future, what exactly is going on? Because it looks like the future ends 7 times.
Yeah, so in the introduction, I kind of try to sweep the floor of this, and part of what I'm asking is are we asking Revelation the right questions? Like our assumptions always are tethered to questions, but if you come with a set of questions, what I found is if you ask the wrong question, you'll still find an answer. But the question is are we asking the questions Revelation seems to be asking? So the very first time where you have this strange moment where it seems like we've come to the end of the world. It's in it's in chapter 6. Like we're in the seals, the Lamb is breaking all of them, and in chapter 6, verse 12, he starts to describe. This is where we get the famous, the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, the moon turned blood red. But then it says, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs from a fig tree, as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The thing that's interesting about that is usually this always kind of surfaces the difference between methodologies of, well, I take the Bible literally, you're just taking it figuratively. And so then at this verse I say, okay, fine, well, let's take it literally then. If stars fall to the earth, not a star, multiple stars, the world is over. Like no one would say, okay, but what's tomorrow's weather? Like it would be like, no, it's if stars fall, if the earth collides with a big ball of gas and fire, we're done. But then it keeps going and it describes how the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up. Every mountain and island is removed from its place. Like this is the total uncreation of all creation. Then it moves into this description in verses 15 through 17, and it ends with this. It says, the great day of their wrath, talking about the one who sits on the throne and the Lamb, has come, and who can stand it? Who can withstand this wrath? Well, theology would then say, well, now that's a judgment day image. But the issue is, we're in chapter 6. There's 16 more chapters to go. So if Revelation is this roadmap of the future that's predicting the end, the problem is the world ends in chapter 6. So then what do? Well, then we find it ends again in 11, and we find again that it ends in 14, and then in 16. And it keeps coming to the end of the world because it's not trying to predict the end of the world. It's trying to allow us to have a different vantage by which we can engage the world that we are living in today by understanding the world will come to a cataclysmic end. And there will be a moment where we will stand before the Lamb and before the one on the throne. In light of that, now I'm going to sound like 2 Peter 3. In light of this, how ought we to live? Like that's so the multiple movements to the end of the world, in some sense says, I understand that's valuable, but it decentralizes the end of the world because of its repetition, emphasizing something greater, and I would argue that's the transformation of the reader.
Okay, I'm going to leave that one there and move to what Revelation is really getting about, the transformation of the reader. We already mentioned that John's loneliness, his exile, it gives some kind of, you're looking at a kind of historical context to the book there, what prompted the writing, and it comes from this place of loneliness. And you can see it in John's responses, like you said, this uncontrollable weeping. But yeah, he's been exiled to this island, estranged from these churches. And yeah, so the loneliness can actually be a gateway into intimacy. That was the point we'd made previously.
Yeah.
So on the point about historical background, Jesus's message to the 7 churches. So I don't know if you know this, someone that I've interviewed, Matthew Halstead.
Sounds familiar, but I don't know why.
So he wrote this book, came out like a year ago with Lexham Press, called The End of the World as We Know It, Why the Stuff You've Been Taught About the Bible, the Rapture is Wrong, and Why it's actually good news. Okay, that's like the subtitle. It's something like that. Anyway, so when I read that book and when I interviewed him, I actually didn't know this part, but rapture theology has at least some circles of those that are in that rapture theology said that these 7 churches are like 7 periods of church history.
Right.
And it's peculiar that the church history that's focused on is highly Western / America centralized. It's not even like a global sort of church history point of view. But when I heard that the first time, I was like, what? You can look on a map and there are these real places on a map with the real names. There were churches in these locations. What's more likely, that he was writing to this real place, to this church on a real place on a map, or that this is a 7 periods of church history? So I guess if you could just give us a little bit of the historical background behind Jesus's message to who these 7 churches were, and the background behind Jesus's message to them.
Yeah, no, and your sensibility is exactly right. Again, that's where I kind of referenced earlier this idea of methodology. Like I always find it strange whenever I'm talking about the symbols in Revelation, and I'm told like, well, I take the Bible literally, you're just taking it figuratively. But I'm like, then 7 dispensations? Like I just, the reality is that when it comes to the figurative literal debate, we both know intuitively without arguing or without articulating it. We both know language doesn't work that way. It doesn't fit in these nice little neat boxes of literal and figurative and never goes out. We know that it can't do that. Even how I described that there was describing something literal with the use of a figurative language. Like language where it moves seamlessly within and out. However, when we have historical background, or like you even said there, like actual names of cities that we can plot on a map that are actually in a perfect mail route. If you were going to send a letter from Patmos, the first city you would send it to is Ephesus, and then it follows the exact pattern of the churches all the way to Laodicea and the Lycus Valley on a major Roman trade route, a mail route. These cities, they're really at a unique position in the Roman Empire. The book of Ephesus, or the city of Ephesus, has more books that address that book or that city in the New Testament than any other city. Like it is this, so Acts 17 or Acts 19. We're in Ephesus and we're seeing the different interactions there. This is actually a place Paul wanted to go to because of its strategic location. If you look at a map, and I don't have one handy, but the Asia Minor, which is where the seven churches are, it's starting to verge on the eastern, some of the closer to the eastern border of the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, when you push past Laodicea and Colossae further east, you go into more of Syria, where then if I went south, I would go down to Judea. But Syria then moves over to the Parthians and Mesopotamia, that region. So it's at kind of this edge of the empire, but it also was a strategic location right next to the Greek Empire. A lot of the Greek city-states from the disparate islands of Greece, whenever they very first came together under Alexander the Great, the first thing they did was start to move east into Asia Minor because it is so rich in resources. So whether it comes to geographically, or whether it even comes to economically, this region is deeply rich. They also are rich in the history of worshiping their kings or Caesars, or I would even argue, or not argue, I would even say their Greek kings in particular. They would usually refer to them in some levels of deity. So Rome had this very strange relationship with them early on. Augustus really struggled with this because as soon as Augustus takes power, wins the Battle of Actium as Octavian in 31, really kind of takes root 29 to 27. You have these cities from Asia Minor, Pergamum, coming in saying, "Hey, can we construct a temple that's in worship of you?" And Augustus has to dance because his adopted dad or his uncle Julius Caesar was killed 13 to 15 years earlier for accepting too high of honors. So Augustus right off the bat goes, "Hey, how about this? How about you make you can make a temple that worships, it is in honor of the Senate, and then you can kind of tack me on at the end." Like Augustus starts to consolidate it, but he does it very shrewdly because this region, though, he had to find a way to keep this region a part of their empire, which would be to satisfy their sensibilities of worshiping their king. But he also had to make sure he didn't accept too much honor, because if he did, then it would tick off the Roman sensibilities. So he dances as a way of gathering this place in. Now we're at the end of the first century, though, AD. And this region has been central to a lot of the different machinations of the Roman Empire for quite some time now. And they have now become a hub of the Christian world. I mean, Paul spends over 2 years in Ephesus. Church history tells us that John lived there, and the apostle, and that even Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived there. So as far as even theologically strategic, these were pretty important cities for the New Testament world.
Now, in what Jesus actually says to these, it'd take too much time to go through individually and say, what did he say?
Sure.
But is there a kind of like theme that runs through them? That's a kind of overall broad message of what Jesus wants from his people.
Yeah, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, but I actually take the theme of intimacy and trace it through these 7 churches, because he knows them inside and out. He knows their city's histories, and the imagery that he uses to communicate his love or his challenge for them is intricately interwoven into the very fabric of the city itself. So, Jesus to the church of Laodicea, he talks to them about how they are lukewarm, and if they don't repent, they make him sick. It makes him want to convulsively vomit them out of his mouth. Well, the city of Laodicea had to pipe in its water. Colossae had natural cold springs. Hierapolis had natural hot springs. Laodicea had to pipe it all the way in, and by the time it got to Laodicea, it was lukewarm. And if you just drank it without, doing anything like boiling it, you would become very sick and convulsively vomit. So he even uses imagery that directly intersects with the very city they're living in. But he also knows them that intimately when it comes to them spiritually. He knows that the city of Sardis has fallen asleep on the battlefield, and so he screams, "Wake up," which actually is something that had happened to that city multiple times in their history leading up to the first century, where their entire city is taken over because the guard just went to sleep because he thought that the city was so secure. So he is constantly speaking to them, meeting them where they're at, but challenging them through the intimate knowledge that he has of them to continue either to persist in their faithfulness or to repent from their rebellion.
Okay, so we've talked about the very opening verses of Revelation,
Hmm.
and then we've gotten into these Jesus' message to these 7 churches.
Hmm.
Now, there's all sorts of imagery throughout the book of Revelation.
Sure.
So much imagery. I'm just trying in this interview to pick out some of the major not I struggle to even say that. I'm sure I'm missing some of the major, but
Sure.
I've selected some of the imagery that at least I think a lot of my viewers might be familiar with. Even if they
Yeah.
haven't read the book of Revelation, you've probably heard these things in hymns or in worship songs or
Yeah.
seen them in popular culture. So, one of the pieces of imagery that's very prominent is this lion and lamb imagery.
Yeah.
So, how should the lion and lamb imagery reshape the way that Christians think about power
Yeah.
and their identity as Christ followers?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're referring to Revelation chapter 5, where that's that moment where John is weeping. Like the one on the throne is holding the scroll, and John is desperate for a word from the Lord, being in exile and at the end of the first century, last living apostle potentially could be dying. And is Rome going to win? And no one is worthy to open the scroll. And he starts to bitterly weep. And then this elder comes along and puts his arm around John and he says, "Hey, no, 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 don't cry. Don't cry. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah." And the lion is this image of power. It is this image of force and ferocity. And this kind of regal image that we even have today would have still been reverberating in the ancient world. But what's fascinating is then when John looks, he does not see a lion. He sees a lamb, and it says he sees a lamb standing in the throne as if it had been slain. So it's this strange where he's looking to see the power of a lion, but what he sees is actually a lamb that had been sacrificed, that through its sacrifice, it is now reigning. Which isn't just this paradox. It isn't just this, this jarring or trying to like startle us with, bait and switch. You thought you're going to see a lion, but it's actually a lamb. It's a part of Revelation's unveiling that the way that Jesus Christ acquired power, true power, over the true enemy was through sacrifice on the cross, by being the slain lamb. The irony is that even John and even the martyrs under the altar in Revelation 6, they struggle with this definition of power. The disciples, even when they were with Jesus, struggled with this definition of power. Like, who is the greatest in the kingdom? And they're jockeying for position and asking, whenever you come into your glory, can I be at your right hand and I be at your left? I mean, this is James and John. And Jesus is constantly in the Gospels, but especially in Revelation, trying to to open our eyes to the fact that power through him has been redefined. That in Revelation, what looks like suffering is actually victory. And what looks like dominance or oppression is actually the way that you lose. And so, lion, you look for power, you find a slain lamb. Revelation goes, yeah, that's right, because in Christ, power is not defined by how you murder your enemies well. It's actually defined by being willing to be sacrificed on behalf of your enemies.
I've been reading, in addition to your book, Scott McKnight's, and he has a co-author called, what's the name of that book?
Is it Revelation for the Rest of Us?
Yeah, Revelation
Okay,
for the Rest.
yeah.
I love that book.
Yeah.
That's been super insightful for me. And because I grew up in a context that was like heavy duty rapture.
Okay.
Like I was watching all those my family owned like the whole Left Behind book series, and they
Okay.
turned those things into movies. And like
Yep.
as like an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, I was watching those movies, seeing tanks roll in,
Oh
and
boy.
like all
Scared
sorts of
into
wild
scared into
stuff.
heaven.
Yeah, um, like the Battle of Armageddon. Yeah, so it was, and so growing up, I just kind of like adopted that view
Yeah.
uncritically,
Sure.
and so you think, well, in Jesus's first coming, at least this was my
Yeah.
thought for a long time.
Hmm.
In Jesus's first coming, he was this very, gentle Jesus.
Sure.
Not to say that he didn't have harsh words and
Sure.
like flip some tables,
That's
like
right.
we
That's right.
recognize he did this in his first coming too. But you think of this very compassionate person,
Hmm.
at least for the outsider, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Like maybe the religious elite that,
Yeah.
abuses their power. That's
Yep.
the point. Like
Yep.
the religious elite that abuses their power, he's got some strong words for them. But then it's like he's not going to be like that forever, cuz when he comes back, there's going to be a lot of blood.
Yeah.
And he's coming with a sword and riding a horse. Like this is my image, like
Right.
he's coming with a sword, he's riding a horse, and there's going to be so much blood it's up to the horse's bridle, and
Hmm.
he's just going to slaughter his enemies. And as my faith kind of became my own, and I aged, and matured, I thought, this is a really odd, those things are in deep tension with each other.
Yeah.
The view of Jesus that on this one hand over here, and then in the future like this. So when I began looking into the book of Revelation, um, this became really pivotal for me, this idea
Mm.
of power. He's looking for a lion, but he doesn't see a lion.
Right.
He sees this slain lamb.
Yeah.
And this redefinition of what true power looks like, not
Hmm.
by conquering your enemies, which I hope we can get into some of this during the course of this interview.
Hmm.
Um, I have specific things in the book of Revelation that I want to ask you about
Yeah.
ahead, but not by like, it's not their blood. This was what was so insightful. It's not the enemy's blood.
Hmm.
It's Jesus's own blood
Right.
that is being described. I had never even thought of that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if you agree with that or not. Is it the enemy's blood? Like I know there are different interpretations here. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So there's actually a couple of threads I'll try to pull together to answer what I feel like. I think that the tension that you're sensing is the right tension to be sensing. And whenever that tension is there, I think it should prompt further critical questions, and we don't just allow the tension to silence the sensibility. Because the revelation of Jesus Christ, which is again the first 5 words of Revelation, would be very strange if it was the complete opposite of how he came the first coming. It would be very strange, like because it seemed to be his first coming. Everybody was kind of excited that he was unveiling who God is, and he is the image of the invisible God, Colossians 1:15, the exact representation of God's being. But then he like comes in the second coming, and it's like, just kidding. At that first coming, I was just wasn't ready yet to actually like get as rowdy as I wanted to. But I actually think we should allow the first coming to instruct our understanding of what it is that we're even seeing. So, for example, that longing for vengeance, which is just very human, very human. It is brought up in the fifth seal in Revelation chapter 6. And it's the martyrs under the altar in heaven, which is such a wild moment, because I always have people that'll say like, well, I'm not sure I really know what to think about all of this, but when I die, I'll know. And I'm like, you're putting a lot of faith in death to apparently whenever you die, you become omniscient. I don't really know how death has become the cure-all outside of the fact that we're obsessed with death. But even when the martyrs are under the altar in heaven, they cry out, "How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood?" And it's God's response that, to me, in verses 9 through 11, that is such, of chapter 6, that is such a strange response unless you're hearing it, unless you understand God's response through the lens of the cross. He actually hands them a white robe, which that image is startling, because in the ancient world, in the Roman world, a white robe was a symbol of victory. You have won the war. And that's what's ironic is they're saying, when will you actually win the war? And God goes, okay, you've already won. Here's your robe. And part 2, when more of you die. And it's this very odd economy right at the very beginning that after this redefinition of power in chapter 5, you have this redefinition of even suffering or what victory is. And it doesn't tend to match what we think that it should match. So then you get to, I'll skip to chapter 19 before I double back to chapter 14. In chapter 19, verse 13, Jesus comes to this battle. It's the rider on the white horse who, has, a tattoo on his leg that says King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he has a sword coming from his mouth. But it says he's going to the battle and his robe is dipped in blood. And that's such a strange thing because you typically don't get blood on your robe until you've actually fought the battle. So the question then becomes, whose blood is that? Well, there's 2 options because at this point, according to the battle motif, there hasn't been a battle yet. So the enemy can't be it. The only other blood it could be is either his or ours. And that's a fascinating insight because in chapter 12, verse 11, so now I'm going backwards, it says they conquered the dragon, Nikao, where we get the English word Nike. They overcame the dragon by the blood of the Lamb and by the testimony of the saints who would not shrink from death. So now we get to chapter 14. This is where you see the image of the blood as high as the horse's bridle that stretches out 1,600 stadia, which would be miles. And it's invoking imagery from Isaiah 65, the winepress of God's fury, which is one of the more vicious passages in the Old Testament. This, why is your robe stained with crimson? And the answer is because I'm crushing the nations under my feet. Well, there's a couple of different breadcrumbs that we can piece together in chapter 14 that I think inverts the entire Old Testament image intentionally because of the revelation of Jesus Christ. First one is the 144,000 in chapter 14, verse 3. They're referred to as the ones they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, even across. But they're also referred to as first fruits, which is sacrificial language. So they are the first fruits, the ones that follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Then in chapter 14, verses 10 and following, it eventually gets to this blessing in verse 13, where it says, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, for their deeds will follow them and they'll rest from their labor." So now all of a sudden this is very strange. We have the second blessing in the book, which is blessing the people that die. We have this image of the sacrificial people that have followed Jesus wherever he goes, that then moves into chapter 14, verses 13 all the way to 20, this winepress of God's fury. The thing that's fascinating is that in verse 20, it says a couple of things that are interesting. Number one, it uses the word trampled. The only other time so far in Revelation that word's been used is in chapter 11, verses 1 through 2, where it talks about the trampling of the outer courts, which is the church on earth. The second time, by the Gentiles, the second element in chapter 14, verse 20 that's interesting is the word blood. In the book of Revelation, the word blood, when it is only attached to, when it is attached to a human, it is only attached to Christ or one of his followers. It is never attached to enemies, not once. Now, it's attached to the earth or creation a couple of times, but never enemy, never people that don't belong to God. The third thing that's interesting is you see this wine press connected to blood, and in chapter 17, verse 6, you see this prostitute who has intoxicated the kings of the earth with her wine, and it says that she was drunk on the blood of the saints. So when you piece all of this together, instead of this imagery of the nations being crushed under the feet in chapter 14 and the blood going, it's actually us that's being crushed so that our enemies have a chance to experience the same grace that we did. And where did I get that idea? The cross of Jesus Christ. That while we were still enemies, Jesus died on our behalf so that we would have a chance to experience his grace. So Revelation is actually, it's pretty clear in its depiction, but we have, like the martyrs under the altar in heaven, we have a hard time accepting that is the way that we win. It just doesn't seem like winning, especially when you're obsessed with death.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and that was a big illumination for me, and honestly, it makes me excited to read the book of Revelation again. I think
Hmm.
for many years, I was like, "I know that book's in the Bible, but nobody understands that book, and I'm gonna spend my time elsewhere,
Yeah.
not there."
Yeah, actually,
And
Scott
but
McKnight and I were talking about this because you and Scott, your guys' growing up was very similar,
mm.
where you were in that setting of dispensational. But I grew up in a church, we didn't touch that thing. Like, we didn't touch that book at all. Crispest pages in our Bible were the book of Revelation.
That's funny. Um, okay, so we've talked about the lion and the lamb imagery and what this actually tells us about what real power is.
Mhm.
So, what real power looks like, if anything, it's it's like martyrs are
Mhm.
incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
Like that's what comes through. Like and I assume it's that kind of just love. I mean
Mhm.
I don't know that John identifies it as like what is it about them that's so powerful exactly? It
Mhm.
would seem to be that in spite of I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of fear involved, but, it's like that overcoming of the fear
Mhm.
and willing to completely sacrifice yourself for the sake of someone else, that kind of,
Mhm.
like, deep love, that's really powerful to me. That's what real
Yeah.
power looks like to me, rather than I can control various, uh,
Yeah.
other people
Yeah.
and conquer other people. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. When Jesus is at his strongest, when he is in the most controlled that he is in whenever he was here on earth, it's actually whenever he's standing before Pontius Pilate. And he has no need to even say a word. And Pontius Pilate is under this illusion of power. Don't you know that I have the power to either take your life or give it? And Jesus says, that's adorable. No, you actually don't. I'm here because I've chosen to be here. There is this, whenever death and the fear of death no longer becomes your tyrannical leader, you're actually free to engage life fully, even if it means offering yourself, allowing yourself to be sacrificed. So it also reminds me, though, a couple of things also came to mind when you were talking about the martyrs. Paul has this very strange fascination with fellowshipping with Christ in his suffering. In the same way that loneliness becomes this conduit through which, because we all experience loneliness, that's kind of the good news of this is, since everyone experienced loneliness, if that actually can lead to intimacy, then finding God's not going to be that difficult because loneliness will find you. Same thing with suffering. Like even in the American West, where frankly we do as much as we can to insulate ourselves from as much pain as possible, we still are struggling with pain and depression and loneliness, and we are still suffocating under our own numbing agents. And as a result, if suffering, though, becomes a conduit also through which intimacy with Christ can be experienced, then you don't go looking for suffering, but when it inevitably finds you, you can engage in a very different manner than simply trying to get away from it. With that in place, too, I'll also say this: if John on Patmos, even is if it is the Apostle John, or if it's a remembrance of the Apostle John, one of the things that is interesting is John sees martyrdom as a gift to be given. It is not something that you can seize, because he actually, according to church history, is the only apostle that was not martyred. And if you're thinking of that, where he's looking at all of his other, the 11, including, Paul later, and all of them have been killed. But according to church tradition at this point, they've tried to kill John multiple times and he just can't die. And I think there's a part of John, and I had this own experience in my own life about a decade ago or so, where I don't know why, but I always thought I was going to die young. And in some ways, I felt like I even kind of like would brazenly tried. So like the summer after 9/11, I went to the Middle East to evangelize and love on Muslims, because I'm going, I don't know how else to respond outside of the love of Jesus Christ that says, and even still I love you. But I remember turning 34, and I remember having a conversation with Jesus, and I was not happy. because I was starting to come to terms with the fact, like, are you kidding me? I may actually have to live into the point where I just die, like just of old age. And so I told Jesus, and me and Jesus, we have a very different type of prayer life together. But I got mad, and I said, you know what? You may have been tempted in every way as me, and were without sin. But one thing you didn't do was turn 34. And I said that, like the idea of not dying in a firework moment is for me far more terrifying than the idea of living faithfully no matter what circumstances come and just dying of old age. Like, so there's a part of this that even I have to remember whenever John is talking about those martyrs. I think there's even a part of him that goes, in the same way that Peter was frustrated at the end of John's gospel that John may live for a long time, I wonder if John deep down felt, in a sense, left out because he didn't get the gift of martyrdom. And yet, in Revelation 6, the martyrs, they speak a language that even though they gave their lives for the gospel, they still thought vengeance was the ultimate way to win.
Mm.
Which tells
Yeah,
me that even
that's a
when we
good point.
die, we're going to need to continue to transform.
Mm. Yeah, you have a radically different perspective on life even than life and death. But I can see, I'm like, oh, I can see what you're getting at there.
Hmm.
Okay, because we're down to like 15 minutes.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
had planned to talk to you about uh, the chapters that you discuss worship as resistance to Rome's
Sure.
imperial narrative. And I had planned to talk about the trumpets and the two witnesses, but I'm going to kind of skip to the end, if
Sure.
that's okay. I'm going to
No,
skip
that's
over
great.
some of the middle.
Yeah.
Again, I guess everybody does this, right? So we all come from a certain kind of background,
Hmm.
and that's going to influence how you think about something, or at least how you thought about it previously. And this was very much me. So, end of Revelation, Satan gets released, and growing up, I was taught, this is like fairly literal here, that Satan's going to get time to like cause a bunch of chaos in the world, kind of one last oorah before going into the lake of fire. And he's going to take down as many people with him as he can.
Yeah.
And that was the picture that I was given. So you have this super insightful kind of historical background to what's going on behind Satan's release. So you argue that Satan's release isn't actually a threat, which is totally counter to everything I was taught. It's not actually a threat. It's actually part of God's triumph. So can you give that background behind that
Yeah.
idea?
Yeah, actually, that's it was hard writing that chapter because that's what I did my PhD on. And so I was trying to find a way to translate it down into a key that frankly was more useful, if I could even say it in that way. One of the things that we have to notice is in chapter 16, 19, and chapter 20, there's something I call a no battle motif, where that's the funny thing about, this, Battle of Armageddon. Well, when you read the gathering together for war of Armageddon in 16, the very next verse, literally the words that God says right after that is, it's over. Like, he's just like, it's done. Like, there's 3 gatherings for war, and there's never any war. And I think that there's an image there, an important something that's being communicated. We've already referenced the other one, and that was when Jesus comes on the white horse. His robe is already dipped in blood. In there is a gathering for war, but there isn't a war. Jesus says a one word, they're all wiped out. It's more of like a sacrifice and execution. Same thing happens in Revelation 27 through 10, where Satan is released, and then he gathers together all of these nations, as numerous as the sands of the sea. They surround the city God's love, and then like Elijah on Mount Carmel, fire comes down from heaven, wipes them all out. It's over. So what's happening there? And the question I began to ask is, why must Satan be released? And I emphasize the word "must" because in the Greek, the word "day" there, it's a divine necessity. Like, it is that Satan has been willed by God to be released. So which makes it even more complicated, where you're going, okay, why would God will Satan to be released? That seems to be a strange, like, it just seems to be weirdly theatrical and unnecessary. So one of the things I noticed is that in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, this angel comes down, and two things are said about Satan. The angel has a great chain. He binds him, which the word even means manacled, like fettered. He binds him, and then he puts him into the abyss or the prison, and it seals it over him, even using the same Greek word for seal in Luke's gospel, where it talks about when the stone was rolled in front of Jesus' tomb, and Rome put a seal over it. Now, the fascinating thing is in verse 7, that seal is broken, but for Jesus it led to glory, and for Satan it leads to destruction. But whenever it says, and after the 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison, but it never says that he would be released from his chains, which is a fascinating image. So that all those pieces I'm going to set down there, and now I'm going to move over to Rome and talk about Rome for a minute. A key feature of Rome was called of Roman society. Like, it saturated the Roman world in its imagery as well as in its story. Matter of fact, even what I was referring earlier about Ovid on that island and he's exiled, he's remembering what is called a Roman triumphal procession. Matter of fact, he's relaying what was received to him about Tiberius's triumphal procession that he heard while he's on this island in exile. A Roman triumphal procession was modern-day American July 4th parades are actually patterned off of Roman triumphal processions. They were these elaborate parades, and it would be something that was awarded to a general until 19 BC. After 19 BCE, Augustus said this can only be a Roman emperor and his family that can do a triumph. But before then, going all the way back to Romulus, the first Roman triumph was in 753 with Romulus. So this is a long tradition. The idea is if there was a significant battle that had been won that expanded the Roman Empire, then the Senate could award that general or that emperor a Roman triumph. And what these triumphs would do is they would actually take spoils of war that they had gathered from their battles, and they would parade them in front of the people of Rome, in the city of Rome. And sometimes it would last for days at a time. The citizens of Rome would come wearing white robes, like we see the army in Revelation 19. And they would come and they're looking for the spoils of war. They even had big floats, and Josephus describes this with the triumphal procession of the Flavian dynasty in 71 CE, which is in celebration of the destruction of the temple. So he's describing these moments where the floats would come and they would have exact pictures of the battle from the destroying of the temple. He says they would even stop the floats and have them reenact moments of the battle, and even at times use those reenactments to execute enemy soldiers. And he even said they preserved the tallest and the most beautiful from the battlefield to march in the Roman triumphal processions. The key feature of every Roman triumphal procession, the key feature was the chief enemy leader marched in chains directly in front of what was called the quadriga, or the chariot pulled by 4 white horses that had the emperor or the general inside of it. But that enemy, it was so important that they at times would imprison different leaders for decades, years at a time, to hold them for this triumph. It was so important to have this person for the triumph, the chief enemy leader, that Augustus, whenever he won the Battle of Actium, Mark Antony and Cleopatra weren't initially killed, so he goes and pursues them. Mark Antony ends up, committing suicide, and he is racing to get to Cleopatra. And whenever they found that she had committed suicide, he actually commanded his people to try to resuscitate her, to try to save her life so that she could be in his procession. And when she died, Dio Cassius says, he began to weep and grieve bitterly as if all was lost because the chief enemy leader was essential. And what you see is the chief enemy leader is manacled and marched across Rome as a way of, in a sense, describing the marching across the world itself that Rome has now subjugated. And at the very end of the parade, the chief enemy leader would be executed or offered in sacrifice to the gods that granted Rome this victory. So putting all that together, whenever I finally looked at all these little trails in Roman history and the imagery that the first century Christians would have been saturated in, the answer to the question, why must Satan be released? The answer is to march in God's triumphal procession. And there are two significant things about that I think are important to emphasize. Number one, Rome is not the chief enemy leader. And that to me is a part of the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's easy to either put all of our hope in empires or to put all of our anger toward the empire. Rome is too small of a target for the book of Revelation. Rome is collateral damage in a much bigger war against a much greater enemy, and that's Satan himself. The second thing is this. We are not waiting for the battle to be won. That was won 2,000 years ago when Jesus' robe dipped in blood was shed on the cross itself. All we're waiting is for the victory parade to consummate the victory that Christ won on the cross.
That's really powerful. I know we only have 5 minutes left, so I think I'll wrap it up like this. We didn't get to. Well, actually, okay. I'm gonna skip to the final question that I sent you.
Sure.
Since it's the end of Revelation, I think it will give an opportunity to tie things up with the book.
Mhm.
So in Revelation 21 and 22, you say, I found this funny. You say that God is giddy, and specifically, He's giddy to get to dwell with humanity.
Yeah.
That's something apparently He's been wanting for a long time. So that part of John's revelation, the unveiling, that part of it, how does that inform us about what the goal of the whole biblical story is about?
Yeah. It's funny. The reason why I characterize that as him being giddy is because he almost like panically starts to be agitated in the way he's describing what's happening. Like in Revelation 21, 1-7, he's like, and I will be their God, and they will be my people, and I will be with them, and they will be with me, and we'll be together. Like he's like repeating himself like my kids do when they come home from school and they're talking about their recess. They're like, there's the slide, and I went down the slide and up the slide and over to the slide. And I'm like, so you're excited about the slide. There's this. But he is. And it reminded me when I was reflecting on Revelation 21 and 22, two things really hit me. Number one, so much of the discussion in the churches that I've grown up in and have served for the past 30 years, so much of the discussion about our salvation has to do with getting to a place. And that was one of the things where I asked myself at a certain point, and I've even preached and asked the question, at a certain point we need to be asking, are we worshiping a person or a place? Because we seem so excited to get away from earth and to a place where there is no pain. But we don't realize that was never, no pain was God's goal, but it was intimacy with Him. And John 17, verse 3, even says, eternal life is to know God. It's this union with God that was shattered in Genesis 3. This veil that was put up between us and heaven itself, that God ultimately not only tries to thin, but whenever He dies on the cross, He intentionally, the detail in Matthew's gospel is not just that the sun went dark and that the earth shattered, but that the veil between the Holy of Holies and the rest of creation is torn. Why? Because God doesn't want to have a veil between us and Him. He doesn't want to have this chasm of sin and death between us and Him. He wants to be fully united with us in this beautiful unity where we are fully known and we fully know Him. And that's how Revelation ends. And this beautiful picture of the coming togetherness, or as one of the, I can't remember exactly who it is, but one of the mystics from like the 1600s, when they refer to the word atonement, they would emphasize it is at one meant, the union of, the coming together of us and God. Ephesians 5:31-32 says, this is the reason why the husband will leave the father and mother and will become one flesh with their wives. And it says, for this is a profound mystery, for I'm actually talking about Christ and the church.
Right. Yeah.
Union. That's the goal, and that's what God's looking forward to.
If this conversation has helped you see Revelation in a new light, then you're already rethinking how to approach biblical prophecy. But there's another piece that Christians still wrestle with: the rapture. If you want to see why the rapture isn't biblical, click this video now.